Well, I want to welcome you all here today for the culmination of our Constitution commemoration. We've had about a week of events, and this is the grand finale. It's great we have such a nice crowd. It actually falls on Constitution Day, so it's doubly special. Part of the weekend, part of the day itself. This week, which has featured 4 lectures by members of our faculty, I think all of them, well, almost all of them are here right now, and an outside lecturer, which occurred on Thursday, has been an awful lot of fun. So today's talk, which is going to bring our constitutional commemoration to its conclusion, is going to be about the influence of Plutarch and his discussion of tyrants and statesmen on the American founders. They were very attentive classicists. Much of what they did in designing our Constitution was based on classical experience, and certainly they were very keenly aware in creating a government of the dangers of tyranny. And to do that, we have Dr. Sydnor Roy, who is a relatively new part of our classics department. She got her BA at Swarthmore, a really outstanding institution, and was telling me that she was inspired to be a classicist by her experience there. She has an MA and PhD from the University of North Carolina. She is currently researching Herodotus, but she's interested in a great many things, and what we're going to hear about is her very interesting interest in the intersection between the classical world and the American founding. So let's give a hand to Sydnor Roy.
All right. Well, thank you for coming today. Does that sound good? All right. Excellent. So last week, as we've heard, a lot of varieties of perspectives on America's founding, its constitution, its character, and how America's founding relates to the revolutions in France. Many of our talks focused on the contested nature of the meaning of America's founding and the act of founding something by itself, and the nature of constitutions. And so on my talk today, the 231st anniversary of the signing of the Constitution, I'd like to explore some of the tensions underlying the American Revolution and the writing of the U.S. Constitution, and most specifically the tension between the resistance to tyranny on one side and the desire to establish a stable government on the other, a tension which I think remains with us today. My argument will focus on the figure of the founder or lawgiver as understood from the ancient world, and most clearly relatable to the people of revolutionary America from the biographies of the ancient author Plutarch. Before that, though, a little background into how I got all into this, and sort of the state of debate about the influence of classics on the American Revolution. So way back in 2012, the British Museum sent an artifact, I should click ahead so you can see my title. Sent an artifact up here, and this is called the Cyrus Cylinder. On a tour of the United States. And this sort of football-sized object is a rolling seal that lays out the principles of Cyrus's government over the Persian Empire, which he founded, and its subject states. And it's widely viewed as one of the first proclamations guaranteeing certain human rights, in this case, religious tolerance. A copy of the Cyrus Cylinder sits in front of the UN headquarters in New York, actually. And so part of the exhibit in DC, which I went to out of my interest in the Persian Empire, was dedicated to the influence of Cyrus on later thought. That he was viewed as a founder and a benevolent monarch. And in the 4th century BCE, a Greek historian named Xenophon wrote a work called the Cyropaedia, which means the education of Cyrus, about his life and principles. And Xenophon's account influenced Machiavelli in his writing of The Prince and later theories of republicanism. And through these figures, Cyrus influenced some of the thinking of the founders of the American Revolution. And the best thing about it was that the exhibit had a copy, Jefferson's own personal copy of Xenophon's Cyropaedia in ancient Greek on display. And when I go up to look at it, I look down and realize that Jefferson has corrected the Greek. Like, it's not corrected a translation of the Greek. He's corrected an error in the printing of the text. So he really knew his Xenophon. And so after that, this sort of pushed me to launch into a period of study of the classical influences on the American Revolution. And I found, to my surprise, that many scholars of political science don't view the classical world as that important. They view classical references as sort of shorthand for showing off. It's like a good quote that you get out of a book, not actually meaningful. But I wasn't quite convinced. And as Caroline Winter has argued quite well, what we see is that some founders were sort of deep scholars of the classics. And this would be people like Jefferson or Hamilton or Madison. And others were a bit more casual in their knowledge. But even this casual claim seems a little weak when we think about, well, casual knowledge of the classics today, how does that compare to casual knowledge of the classics in the 18th century? And so I have been hunting down evidence of the influence and knowledge of classics and classical texts and classical history in the more popular world that is not the sort of elite circles of educated Americans at the time. So in translations and references and school curricula and libraries. And what I found is that histories of the ancient world were numerous at the time, as were popular plays about these figures, translations of several of the school texts that sort of standard that for people to read in Latin or Greek were actually translated into English for everybody else. And so these school texts of Cicero, Seneca, Aristotle, and most importantly for us today, Plutarch. And so this suggests to me a populace that wouldn't just gloss over references to the ancient world as showy, but one with enough knowledge, even without a college education, to engage in what these references mean. And so let us get on to the substance of today's talk. The period between 1775 and 1776 was an exciting one, both for the decision to rebel and for the opportunity that rebellion made to create and try out new forms of government. There was, I think, a sort of founding fever present in America, and I think perhaps best captured by this quote from John Adams. John Adams helped to write the Massachusetts Constitution and was asked by the state of North Carolina to advise them on writing their own, and this is part of his letter to the North Carolinians. And he writes, "You and I, my dear friend, have been sent into life at a time when the greatest lawgivers of antiquity would have wished to have lived. How few of the human race have ever enjoyed an opportunity of making an election of government more than of air, soil, or climate for themselves or their children. When, before the present epoch, had 3 millions of people full power and the fair opportunity to form and establish the wisest and happiest governments that human wisdom can contrive." In a separate letter he wrote to his wife, Adam openly wonders, "I wonder who will be the next Moses, Solon, Numa, or Lycurgus?" And so the figure of Moses would be well known to the Americans from the Bible, but the latter figures, Solon and Numa and Lycurgus, as well as a number of other individuals from the ancient Greek and Roman world, would be best known to Adams and the general public through the writer Plutarch. So let's get into who that guy is. All right, Plutarch. There he is. So Plutarch was a citizen of the Roman Empire, although Greek in identity, and he wrote in ancient Greek. And he wrote an enormous collection of biographies of famous Greeks and Romans, primarily in parallel or in matched accounts, choosing one Greek and one Roman for each set. And he also wrote essays on history writing, not my favorite one, and on morality. And although Plutarch was not the first person to write historical biographies, he's one of our most important from the ancient world. He would choose 2 individuals, identify a shared or similar character trait, and then his accounts would sort of center around how these crucial character traits shaped those individuals' lives. And so basically how he sees character influencing action. But although these biographies display a great deal of research and knowledge, especially into sources we no longer have, there's also a lot of invention, personal bias, and a quite distorted picture sometimes that might result from giving a history based upon a guiding principle of a single character trait. And so I got a list here of a few of the parallel lives, many of them exist, that Plutarch wrote, and which I'm going to be talking about again later. So I'm going to go through a few of these figures right now. So Lycurgus and his parallel Numa are figures from Sparta's and Rome's distant past. Lycurgus is credited with establishing the Republic in Sparta, but more importantly with establishing its norms of thought and of behavior as a militarily oriented aristocratic republic. Numa, built from his predecessor Romulus, the founder of Rome's vision of Rome with a king, a senate, and a military bent, and gave the Romans their character and their customs and their deeply sort of religious beliefs. Solon, from the 6th century, is a much more established historical figure. Plutarch uses Solon's own poetry, other accounts of him, to show how he reluctantly revised the laws of Athens to address major issues in wealth disparity and representation in government, as well as more specific things like trade and marriage and what to do with an unmarried daughter, and all sorts of peculiar specifics. And Solon's was a well-regarded attempt to fix the Athenian system, but he did ultimately fail, and Athens soon fell under the tyranny of a man named Pisistratus, who happened to be a friend of Solon and whom Solon still worked with after he took control and took the tyranny. So it's good to keep in mind. Publicola, his pair, is the name given to Publius Valerius by the Roman people. And he was involved in the conspiracy to overthrow the last king of Rome and establish the Republic. And the leader of that conspiracy to overthrow the kings was a man named Brutus, who he became Rome's first consul. And the consul is an elected military leader and executive in the Roman state, but that position sort of morphed over time in the course of the Roman Republic. And so Brutus, this first consul, chose as his first co-consul a man named Collatinus, but then quickly turned on him and chose Publicola second. And then Publicola went on to be elected consul 3 more times, and even served as sole consul for a while. And so while he had this sort of major military and executive power, he regularized the new republic to some degree, and brokered peace with some of Rome's enemies. But his actions made the people concerned, and they were concerned that he had despotic or monarchical aspirations, but he appeased them through various gestures, some symbolic and some a bit more real. And so Plutarch, though, counts it as a gain that Publicola died soon after his 4th consulship, and so he remained beloved in the eyes of the people. He didn't have a chance to do anything that turned them against him. And so in Plutarch's accounts of Lycurgus, Numa, Solon, and Publicola, we see little hints, and I'll bring out some more throughout the talk, of tyranny or despotism or fear of it. But these are sort of covered over with the benefits that they accomplished, or at least attempted to accomplish. But these later figures, Pericles, Fabius, Alexander, and Julius Caesar, all have a bit more, although they are lawgivers or great leaders, a bit more of a tyrannical, let's say, bent. So Pericles, an Athenian leader who helped develop a strategy for Athens to stay the course during the long Peloponnesian War with Sparta, is presented much more, though not fully, like a demagogue or a tyrant, essentially described as a man who led a city that was in name a democracy, but in reality a government by one man. Fabius, who developed Rome's strategy against Hannibal's invasion by avoiding direct conflict with his army, and was officially named dictator a few times, is again, has that hint of absolute power, but chooses to not fully exercise it. Alexander and Julius Caesar, however, were both great conquerors, great propagandists, and actually pretty great lawgivers too, and maybe perhaps necessary figures for their times. But generally, in our portrait of Julius Caesar, we get a picture of a strong demagogue, brilliant though he may be, bringing about the end of the Roman Republic. And that those who resisted Caesar, such as Brutus and Cato, are important figures for the anti-federalists, and we hear about them actually in a number of lives. So if these are the lives and they're out there in the world, in the ether, how are we sure that people read them, and what access would they have to them? So, Plutarch essentially experienced a resurgence of a renewed interest during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. He was first translated into Latin, and then into French, and then into English in 1579. Actually, the first English translation was based off of the earlier French one. And this first translation became deeply popular and is widely regarded as the influence on Shakespeare's tragedies from the Greek and Roman world, most significantly as Coriolanus and as Julius Caesar. 100 years later, Dryden organizes a translation of Lives directly from the original Greek. And in 1770, the poet John Langhorne and his brother William published an extremely popular translation, which went into multiple reprintings. And so all three of these translations, as well as Amayot's original French translation, older Latin translations, and editions of the original Greek, were widely published in colonial America, with frequent reprintings. In addition, the implicit influence of the ideas of Plutarch and how he presents these individuals made its way to the Americas through the plays of Shakespeare, and perhaps especially importantly, the play Cato by Madison, which is based in large part off of Plutarch's biography of Cato the Younger, who was a well-known opponent of Julius Caesar in the final days of the Roman Republic. And that play is significant because it's the source of some of those great lines like "Give me liberty" or "Give me death," or "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country." So very much a classical play that was part of the classical discourse. And so, thus, Plutarch and the famous men he wrote about were household names in revolutionary America. Even Benjamin Franklin, who strongly opposed a traditional classical education in Latin and Greek, which was standard at the time, supported teaching Plutarch in translation, wrote extensively about his enjoyment of reading Plutarch's Lives, and encouraged its place in libraries and school curricula across the new nation. So, Plutarch was not just read by the elite and educated, for college-level education was relatively rare in colonial America, but actually rather high among the founders. And best guesses at literacy rates at the time, if you're interested in that, is that for white men, literacy rates in the 1770s are estimated to be between 75% and 90% of the population. In a sort of longer-term study, literacy rates among women went up from about 50% in 1730 to nearly 100% in 1810. So a large literate population of both white men and women. And debate was strong among the slaveholding states about the importance of teaching reading to the enslaved. But in this period, and this radically changes soon thereafter, many states had laws, or at least unwritten strong customs, that an education is a significant expectation of the slaveholder, and a necessary one if he was planning on manumitting his slaves. So Plutarch was an accessible and engaging option for many people reading and attempting to learn to read, and especially for those interested in gaining access to the education and conversations of the middle and upper class. And so essentially what we find is, as the scholar Carl Richard put it, if your family could afford one book, you bought the Bible. But if you could afford a second, you bought Plutarch's Lives. And so, as we'll see, allusions to Plutarch and his lives pepper popular discourse as represented in newspapers, public pamphlets, published debates, and meeting notes. And again, that we sort of see, and Richard argues this as well, that Plutarch influenced heavily the founders' concepts of liberty, tyranny, power, and government. But the nature of that influence is a complex question and carries with it the implication that there is a right or obvious way to read and understand Plutarch and the lives of the men that he represents, that he writes about. Plutarch himself was a relatively subtle author whose nuanced portraits suggest multiple ways of understanding a single man and his actions. And also Plutarch, if we're thinking about founding a new democratic republic, like almost all writers from the Greek and Roman world, did not like democracy, especially the radical democracy of Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries, which he viewed as chaotic and crass. He writes as a citizen of an empire that is pro forma a republic. Yeah, it's got a senate and assemblies and consuls, but has functionally been an autocracy for over 100 years. And his accounts, especially of the founding figures of Athens, the Spartan Republic, and the early kings of Rome, and those first figures of the Roman Republic, have already undergone 300 or more plus years of reimaginings and through multiple revolutions. And civil wars. So in his writings, we can say, well, look at it, and well, it's interesting to think about how he presents character and those attendant virtues and vices, but how he presents the virtues of government and principles of government, like liberty and tyranny, or ideas of government, and the like, are much more complicated to sort out. Or we can think about it a different way, that he could present an individual whose character trait is as a lover of liberty or justice, but how they show that, how they're received by other people, and the results of their actions are hugely varied. So let's get to one of these guys for an example. And I'm going to focus a lot on Solon today, our Athenian lawgiver. And so Solon wrote, and one of the most quoted things by Solon during this period is this quote. When as later he had written the best laws for the Athenians, he said, oh, the best that they would accept. This quote is used 3 times by 3 separate people during the Constitutional Convention, twice in the Federalist Papers, and at least 7 times in the various ratification debate records. And that's just a sort of superficial survey of how often this quote comes up. And the sort of fascinating thing is how it's used. Those who use it during the convention are often saying, okay, this is a problem that you're suggesting. They're using it to argue against elements of the Constitution. For example, poor representation for the smaller states. And part is basically using it as a call to compromise. We're not here to do the best, we gotta just work together. But the Federalist Papers use the quotation essentially with sort of an element of false modesty describing what they've done. And when it appears in the ratification debates, we see a divided use. One, people are saying this Constitution is not acceptable, we have to make something that the people will accept. Or 2, this Constitution is the best we could do, we're not claiming perfection. And as Jefferson will note, and also by implication in the Federalist Papers, when they use this argument that the Constitution that they wrote is the best that the people would accept at the time, is an attitude that sort of perhaps allows for changes in interpretation of the document and amendments, or even wholesale rewriting as time and circumstances evolve. They're using this to justify what they've written. So that's sort of an overview of Plutarch. I'm going to give you a new parallel overview of what's going on at the time and how Plutarch sort of pops up into conversations. So, and the historical background of this period and what people are doing is, I'm going to have to apologize for some broad strokes, but it's the danger of a talk from a non-Americanist. So when the Constitution was written in 1787, fierce debates about the nature of government and its powers have been ongoing since before the Revolution in 1776. And we see it both among the elite circles of power in discussions of ideas from the Enlightenment that turn into speeches and articles for the broader public. And we also see it in the various state constitutions written and rewritten in this period, where people, all the people, gained firsthand knowledge on the realities of different types of Republican-style government. And so if we look at the Declaration of Independence and the speeches and writings in support of the Revolution, we find 2 parallel themes. 1, the people of the colonies are oppressed under a tyrannical system and a tyrannical king. And 2, that they deserve representation in and accountability from their government. As we heard last Monday, the Declaration offers a sort of intermixing of the ideals of Locke on natural rights and Hobbes's portrait of the absolute ruler. But these ideas have older roots, particularly on the nature of tyranny. Aristotle's Politics, which itself builds off of older Greek texts and history, offers a typology of tyranny that is clearly reflected in the Declaration's list of King George's wrongs. And whereas before the Declaration, we see appeals to king and parliament for taxation with representation, in the Declaration we see that parliament has already been rejected. It's not really mentioned. And as illegitimate to the Americans, since, again, no representation there. And so the Declaration is focused upon showing that the king could have been a good giver of laws, but he's not, so he's a tyrant. But perhaps the most accessible way of looking at how Aristotle and other Greek thinkers influenced the Declaration, rather than more recent figures like Locke or Hobbes, is to look at that famous line or think about it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Locke suggests that the fundamental rights are life, liberty, and property. The replacement of property with happiness, as Eric Nelson, among many, many others, has argued, is a distinct nod to Aristotelian and generally Greek thoughts on ethics and man's purpose. And while Aristotle is not a theorist of natural rights, he does in part define a tyrant as a figure who violates both laws and norms, which leads to the death, subjugation, and unhappiness of his people. But I'll get more into a different fundamental notion of tyranny in Aristotle a little bit later, and both of these models influence how Plutarch presents things. So after the same time as the Declaration, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union were being drafted and accepted by Congress in 1777, but not fully ratified until 1781. Maryland was just a weird late holdout. And so even so, it had been operating in essentials to prosecute the war since its inception. The style of government laid out by the Articles represent the predominant themes of avoiding a tyrannical system and granting representation through the use of smaller and varied state governments as opposed to a large federal one. Indeed, the second article states, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence in every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States. And just to mention, the Declaration of Independence also writes and claims individual state sovereignty, not the sovereignty as a group as a whole. And so the explicit purpose of the Union under the Articles is mutual defense and the securing of liberties. It guarantees free movements between the states. Delegates to the U.S. Constitution are selected in whatever manner seems good to state legislatures. These delegates are paid for by the state that they represent. Each state will get one vote in Congress, regardless of how many delegates they send. It forbids states to ally amongst themselves without permission, or to ally with foreign powers singly, or to commit acts of war without Congress's consent. And so essentially only the United States and Congress altogether have the right to declare war. A common treasury will be formed with the states contributing in proportion to the value of their land, and that evaluation will be carried out by the states. And it goes on to list further limitations on the several states and the United States. And the Articles essentially, yes, and the Declaration most clearly establish the primacy of the separate states. There's no provision for individual representation in the federal government, and all states are viewed as equal concerns in regards to representation, although not in contribution to the war. But significantly, for what follows, it leaves the determining of that contribution to the war to each of the states, which had the probably obvious result. And we get to the problem of giving a mandate to prosecute a war without the authority to raise money for it is a clearly problematic position to put the federal government in. So this leads to large loans being taken out, most significantly from France and Holland, to pay for the war effort. And even with those large loans, there wasn't enough to pay soldiers. And so deep frustration reigned among the citizenry and the army. And as the war ran down, we see several pieces of evidence pointing towards a reconsideration of the Articles of Confederation, some more benign than others. And so one of the less benign is the Newburgh Conspiracy, which in 1783, officers in the Continental Army met to discuss action in their grievance about their lack of pay. And this occurs after Congress had voted down a tariff right for the United States proposed to raise funds for the Army. And while the full seriousness of this event is debated, and it's before the signing of the Treaty of Paris, but after the surrender of Cornwallis, but so the full seriousness is debated, and how far actions went to realize the, quote, fatal threat that they wanted to make to Congress. It's significant that this shook up several leaders in the military, and most notably George Washington, who's generally credited with calming this conspiracy. And then in 1786, a second event shook more individuals to considering the need for a different style of federal government, and that's Shays' Rebellion. And out of many causes of this unrest, a significant one is that money was promised but not paid to veterans of the Revolutionary War. And they went home and needed money to restart their farms. They were not given any because money was tight across the United States. And so after years of frustration, they rose up and took over the local armory and started a massive sort of rebellion in the state of Massachusetts. And this rebellion lasted a little bit longer than it perhaps should have, because there was no money to pay for forces to take it down. Again, if the federal government has no money, they can't raise money to have protecting forces around. And this was eventually done by a private state militia, which is actually explicitly against the laws in the Articles. And they felt sort of uncomfortable about doing that. But as many have acknowledged, this more than the Newburgh conspiracy could push Washington, as well as others, to join the quest for a new government. Federalists like Hamilton and Madison were already there. The more benign reactions to the Articles of Confederation appear in sort of two separate events. One is the Annapolis Convention. This is where delegates from 5 states, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Virginia, get together to propose some amendments or revisions and just sort of talk about maybe what can we do to change the Articles. And this meeting resulted in a message to Congress that they had come to the unanimous position that Congress should invite commissioners to Philadelphia in order to think about the situation in the United States and, quote, devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. And so they want to be able to, they say we should have a meeting and just have people do whatever they need to do to fix this. So this is taken to Congress, and a member of the Annapolis Convention and a member of Congress at the time is James Madison. But he did not succeed in getting it passed at first. Congress voted it down, actually pretty significantly. But eventually came around and said, okay, why don't we revise what this convention should do? And so they agreed to invite delegates to attend a convention in Philadelphia, quote, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. And so thus, Congress gave the Convention of Delegates a slightly different mandate than the Annapolis Convention requested. Not, whatever seems necessary, but the sole and express purpose of revision, so no rewriting wholesale. But not to be deterred, James Madison, at both the convention and Congress, immediately wrote to Thomas Jefferson in Paris and said, "What do I read?" And he got a huge reading list and began constructing his notes. And we have James Madison's notes on the debates of the Constitutional Convention, but we also have notes and notes and notes of all the earlier republics that he studied and thought about as a possible model for the new U.S. government. At the same time, John Adams, ambassador to the Netherlands at the time, and probably dying that he wasn't there in the United States, felt that he needed to influence and advise the proceedings. So he wrote a series of letters, a defense of the constitutions of the government of the United States, which gathered examples of political governments, republics run by monarchs, oligarchies, and democracies, or ideal ones posited by Enlightenment philosophers for consideration. And he included several examples from the ancient world, specifically Sparta, Athens, and Rome. And his description and analysis of these states, especially that of Sparta, reflects a strong dependence on Plutarch's representation of them. Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, which outlines the life and reforms of the Spartan lawgiver, is one of our fullest accounts of Lycurgus's possible life from the ancient world. And Adams includes several features in his description that appear in Plutarch alone. But there's really one important distinction. While Plutarch's description of Lycurgus and his reforms is relatively positive and approving, Adams' depiction is deeply negative. While he praises the organization of Sparta and recognizes its lasting impact on republican governments that follow, he states, quote, "The institution of Lycurgus was well calculated to preserve the independence of its country, but had no regard to its happiness and very little to its liberty. As the people's consent was necessary to every law, it had so far the appearance of political liberty, but the civil liberty of it was little better than that of a man chained in a dungeon." So he goes on to claim that Lycurgus did all of this, all his reforms, actually to exalt his own family. And as time progressed, the Spartans and their kings fell into greater and greater degeneracy because of that. And Plutarch doesn't quite show this, but the fall of Sparta would have been known in Plutarch's time. So Adams's interpretation of Plutarch's Lives is a controversial one, but not really an unjustified view. But his interpretation, he goes against people, such as his own cousin, Sam Adams, who had a really great wish to see Massachusetts become a, quote, Christian Sparta. So John Adams is paying attention to, is this a republic or is this some kind of crazy design by a man out for self-interest? Whereas everyone else sort of says, this is a good republic. Of Athens, Adams sees Solon and his laws as the fundamental underpinning of the democracy, although the democracy was founded a couple generations after Solon. He gives Solon credit for trying, but notes his failures as well. And he too also quotes that Solon was obliged to establish a government that the people would accept. And so this great lawgiver, Solon, who will, with Lycurgus, be held up to, as such by those defending the Constitution, was worthy of honor, but unsuccessful in Adams's account. Adams here, too, is influenced by Plutarch, but offers a more positive version than Plutarch does. Plutarch sort of sees Solon as a slightly wishy-washy figure who set down some pretty strange laws, made up pretty words to cover over some real problems, and collaborated with tyrants at the end of his life. Whereas Adams claims that Solon challenged the tyrant and then left the city to avoid the disappointment of the people. So he's changing the story from Plutarch's Lives very particularly. And so with these two figures, Lycurgus and Solon, Adams reshapes familiar material. One lawgiver is made to seem a petty tyrant, the other, with shades and tyranny within him, made to seem ineffective. Good laws and the possibility of tyranny are definitely on people's minds. And while we don't see any reference to Adams's essays in evidence at the convention, they are directly referred to in several of the anti-federalist papers, including Sentinel-1, which I'm going to discuss in a little bit. So we get to the convention itself, which was called to meet on May 14th, but didn't attain a quorum until May 25th. The members came and went, with a total of 55 present for at least some of the time. The proceedings of the convention were sworn to secrecy, which remarkably seems to have been kept. But we do have the notes of Madison as well as Robert Yates published afterwards, as well as a few other individuals. And these notes are fascinating for seeing both the level of argumentation and preparation that so many brought to the convention, but also for seeing some of the randomness in the decisions that were made, especially, say, in terms of term lengths or the appointment of judges and how many judges and all sorts of things. And so for those who came expecting to revise the articles as mandated, a surprise awaited when they got to the convention. Almost immediately, Edmund Randolph introduced the Virginia Plan, which is sort of lays out what we essentially have. And soon later, we get the New Jersey Plan, both of which are pretty big reimaginings of the Articles of the Confederation. And thus, two of the three New York delegates, Robert Yates and John Lansing, left in protest and what they perceived of as the illegalities of the proceedings. And they left, and then they submitted a report to the governor of New York, George Clinton, as to what was going on. And this ended up leaving Alexander Hamilton as the sole representative of New York, and actually without voting powers. He still had a lot of influence, but he wasn't actually voting on anything. And two Maryland delegates also left in protest over the fact of what the convention was doing was too big and too powerful. But the three remained, so they still had enough delegates to vote. And although they stayed the whole time, two Virginia delegates and one from Massachusetts refused to sign at the end. And that's Edmund Randolph, the guy who introduced the Virginia Plan, as well as George Mason and Elbridge Gerry. Randolph was very unnerved by the powerful executive. And so these delegate protesters, their resistance sort of underpins the opposition that we see to the Constitution in the anti-federalist writings and in the speeches of the major figures who opposed the Constitution, such as Patrick Henry and initially John Hancock at the ratification debates. And here's the arguments. The writers of the Constitution were violating their mandate. What they have done is illegal. The Constitution has no Bill of Rights, as all state constitutions did at the time. And it did not and could not offer sufficient representation for the people, and hence was a threat to republicanism. Many fear that it would essentially lead to a de facto monarchy or to an aristocratic state. And so, the substance of the resistance to the Constitution, as with the Revolution 11 years prior, is a concern over the lack of protections for the people against tyranny and a lack of accountability, especially when it comes to representation. And so, as we discussed earlier, throughout the convention, the specter of Solon, and to a lesser degree Lycurgus, was raised in discussion. And they returned to the forefront in the ratification debates. And these lawgivers both, become part of the substance of the arguments both for and against the Constitution. And so how does that work? All right, so last spring, Jim Caesar gave a compelling talk, which has since appeared in print in National Affairs, on how Madison and a few other founding fathers used the idea of the ancient founders, such as Solon and Lycurgus, to cultivate an image of those writing the Constitution as founders with a capital F. And this creates a unique element in history, since, as we've heard, most European nations, and the French in particular, were vastly opposed to the concept of a founder, or a single or even a group of founders. And so although Madison's project worked in the long term, his cultivation of the founder concept was fraught with debate as the Constitution moved towards ratification, and as the early figures in office began to negotiate what a government under this Constitution would look like in reality rather than just on paper. So let's look at Federalist 38, where Madison brings the founder idea to the fore. And this letter intends, in part, to justify and explain the extra-constitutional nature of the writing of the Constitution and of the Convention, and he does it through an appeal to ancient lawgivers. And this is the opening paragraph. It's not a little remarkable that in every case reported by ancient history, in which government has been established with deliberation and consent, the task of framing it has not been committed to an assembly of men, but has been performed by some individual citizen of preeminent wisdom and approved integrity. Which is quite a claim he's making for himself. His examples from Greece and Rome are definitely a list of heralded names, but even he recognizes that some of them got their powers irregularly, and that's sort of that last paragraph, but I won't talk about it at this moment. And so Madison, raises the specter of the founder, and he says, yes, that's like us, and you have to sort of do it extra constitutionally. That's how it works. But as a deep classicist that Madison was, he would have been familiar himself with one of Aristotle's, among others, other fundamental definition of a tyrant, which is essentially that someone who comes to power in a irregular way or through extra-constitutional means. And this was Aristotle wrote this to be sort of the starting unbiased definition of a tyrant that you could then go through and say, well, then they start doing bad things. But essentially what you see is that tyrants themselves aren't necessarily bad. They come to power in irregular ways, but maybe that's not bad. But given that name, and when it's used, they can be very, very dangerous. And so, while Madison claims for the writer's position in a long history of lawgivers, he also reveals how close they are to that suspicion of tyranny, since their actions are extra-constitutional, or at least in many people's opinion. In addition, since these figures have already been complicated, Solon and Lycurgus in particular, by contemporaries such as John Adams, and they're pretty complicated in Plutarch's own biographies of them, he is simultaneously defending the Convention and the Constitution and opening it up to suspicions of tyranny and self-interest, and for the potential for things to go very, very wrong. In a further way, however, that the Federalist Papers both justify and try to indicate, justify themselves, but also perhaps indicate the inherent precarity of what the Constitution represents, is in the choice of the name that they published under, Publius. So, Publius, when they write under that, is a reference to Publicola, that early founder of the Roman Republic, whose life is paired with Solon's, which is not, I think, something that people would notice that it was paired with Solon. And so, as we see from Plutarch's comparison and the lives of Publicola and Solon, which I've sort of bolded for you up there, Plutarch claims, and though Solon justly gloried that when arbitrary power was absolutely offered to him by circumstances, and when his countrymen would have willingly seen him accepted, he yet declined it. Still Publicola merited no less, who receiving a despotic command converted it to a public popular office, and did not employ the whole legal power which he held. And so essentially, he said, this comparison and this presentation of Publicola is both of them are known for having the opportunity to have despotic or tyrannical power and turning it down. And I think that, perhaps there's a tradition that we have in the United States. It is good and right to celebrate people who could have been tyrants, but were not. But I would perhaps suggest that if you've just devised a system that is under the suspicion of tyranny, it might not be the best idea to raise the possibility. In addition to Publius in the Federalist Papers, we see a number of the pro-Constitution, the Federalist writers, writing under names such as Fabius and Pericles, Achaeus, and Atheniensis. So they're all sort of allying themselves in various ways with these founder figures. But I think what is telling with the choice of the name Publius is that Publius is not generally, still really isn't generally the most popular of the lives that people choose to read. Nor were these individuals the most famous, the ones written about in plays by Shakespeare and things like that, especially in defense of republics and republican ideals. Those big names, like Brutus, the name of the co-founder of the Roman Republic and challenger to the last king of Rome, as well as the name of the most important assassin of Julius Caesar. Names like Brutus, who would be known to them through Plutarch's Lives, through Shakespeare, and through the general market popularity of anything to do with Julius Caesar, that's a big name. Everyone would be like, yes, Republic. And Cato, pretty big name with Addison's Cato. And so you take that name, people say, yes, a Republican. But those names are taken up by prominent opponents to the Constitution. And I just sort of want to note here, I won't be focusing on as much, is that the figures of Brutus and Cato are not universally good themselves. Dante's Inferno has Brutus in the bottom circle of hell being devoured by Satan as a traitor. So he's not overall a positive picture, but he's generally held up as this Republican defender of republics. And so let's look at some of those names that the Anti-Federalists took. Sentinel 1, which is one of the most reprinted of the 18 Sentinel articles and of the Anti-Federalist papers in general, offers a broad refutation of the Constitution. And the choice of the pen name, let's say, explicitly from Plutarch's Lives, is actually just Roman. The author chooses the archaizing C rather than the normal S, which was thought at the time to make it look more Roman. And essentially it conveys this idea of Roman watchfulness and guarding. And the author expresses one of the big concerns that the Anti-Federalists had about the Constitution, that they did this extra-constitutionally and were looking out for their own interests. And he claims of the Constitution, it has none of the essential requisites of a free government. It is neither founded on those balancing restraining powers recommended by Mr. Adams and attempted in the British Constitution, or possessed of that responsibility to its constituents, which, in my opinion, is the only effectual security for the liberties and happiness of the people. But on the contrary, it is the most daring attempt to establish a despotic aristocracy among freemen that the world has ever witnessed. He goes on to express a very deep concern about the lack of accountability and the liability towards tyranny, and also suggests that Ben Franklin signed it because he was too old and got tricked, and that George Washington signed it because he was too dumb. And so essentially just assuming nefarious plots everywhere. But note, importantly, the mention of John Adams's essays. Brutus, which was the pen name of Robert Yates, one of those New York delegates who left early, expresses another concern about the lack of accountability in the new Constitution, this time in terms of the size of the nation. There's too much power in the center for the voices of the many to be heard, and that consolidation of power historically results in tyranny. And he doesn't even have to mention Britain's treatment of the United States here. He just talks about how the Roman Republic worked when it was small and in Italy or just the city of Rome, but it became despotic and tyrannical and shifted from a republic to having an emperor after it expanded too greatly. So in choosing the name Brutus, that Republican loyalist and that conspirator against Julius Caesar, he aligns himself as someone willing to betray a friend for the greater good. He's for the values and meaning of republicanism. And if we look at our other pen names from the Anti-Federalists, these also reflect figures who challenge tyranny, like Cato. The choice Junius Americanus is essentially taking Brutus's first name, Junius, Marcus Junius Brutus, his nomen, and saying, and adding American to it. So another shout out to Brutus. And my favorite one is, and choosing the tribune as sort of a tribune is an elected function in the Roman Republic that could veto anything and sort of was viewed as a control on the aristocratic powers of the Senate. And so, essentially, yes, they collect figures who challenge tyranny and respect the will of the people. And all of these figures and all these pen names that they choose to write under would be well known to the people as they read them in newspapers published throughout the United States, over 200 separate presses in the colonies at this time, through their popular histories and through Plutarch's Lives. And as Eran Shalev has argued, the choice of these names was significant and meant to call to mind the readers the specific histories of the men that they refer to. It's sort of like a little puzzle and a little flag. And something that you could find out if you didn't know who Brutus was, you could talk to the guy sitting next to you in the park or at the bar or at church. Someone's going to know. If you don't know yourselves. And so that they're meant to call to mind these histories and for people to rethink the lives of the pen names they've taken while they're reading the articles. And the significance comes out in some part in how they start responding to each other. That Hamilton, when he's not writing under Publius in the Federalist Papers, he wrote several responses to Cato and that pen name under the pen name Caesar. Which seems like a really, really odd choice, unless he was doing it to remind readers that Caesar brought about Cato the Younger's death. And indeed, Hamilton in particular is so attached to the pen name Publius that he became quite incensed when John Quincy Adams, so John Adams' son, wrote a letter under the name Publicola, so that's the nickname for Publius, against Thomas Paine's Rights of Man in 1791. And he was so incensed that he used his name that many people point to this as actually part of the deeply angry break that happens between Jefferson, Hamilton, and Madison on one side, and Adams and the Federalists on the others. And on for this one, we actually have Thomas Jefferson's notes that he took immediately after his conversation with Alexander Hamilton. Apparently he came storming in and just said, "You took my name." And how can he argue against the French Revolution? And so, essentially, that brings us to this picture I hope that I've given, where they choose these names and they choose these histories, and they're choosing figures of founders, and the people opposing them are choosing the figures of not quite tyrant killers, but maybe tyrant challengers, or people who try to save the republic. And so that in Plutarch's Lives, and the figures he recounts and how to interpret their actions is something up for debate in the ancient world, in revolutionary America, and still now at least in classical studies. And so that Madison and other supporters of the Constitution chose to align themselves with these founders, these figures that they're saying, look, these are lawgivers, and they're choosing to say we should interpret Plutarch and Plutarch's representation and this person's history as they are exceptional lawgivers. But Plutarch's characterization leaves many of these figures open to the suspicion of tyranny, and again, acting extra-constitutionally out of self-interest or demagoguery. And so this opens up that space for the opposition, who almost all take the names of famous challengers to tyrants and tyranny, and essentially openly mock in the ratification debates, who do you think you are? Solon? Like, are you trying to do that? Do you know how bad he was? And we have these great sort of newspaper records of the ratification debates where, again, the choice to align themselves with these founder figures is both mocked and viewed with suspicion. But the writers of the Constitution were attempting to address the problems inherent in the ineffective Articles of the Confederation. And in so doing, we're doing it with a Republican model of checks and balances that was specifically devised to avoid tyranny. But their opponents are not so sure. Again, this is a theory that hadn't been tried out in anyone's, in the modern world, as well as people thought they should have been first. And so their opponents still reflect in their names and their arguments the prevailing spirit of the Revolution of 1776, rather than the spirit of founding that some pick up in 1776, but is much more in the air in 1787. And so they pick up that prevailing spirit of watching out for accountability in government and for opposition to tyranny. And we have to say, okay, well, what was the result? Did this do anything? Why don't we talk, we talk about our founders now. And we could say, well, there's one big important result, which is the Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791. The efforts of the Anti-Federalists are what got those first 10 amendments added to the Constitution, most of them agreeing to ratify only if a Bill of Rights was appended. And this Bill of Rights, of course, lays the groundwork for further expansion of rights under the federal government and the protections therein. But it also set the stage, and this is what I sort of want to end with, and I think perhaps bred into our American bones, for this suspicion of tyranny, and tyranny in any kind of law-giving that we might see, which is perhaps a useful suspicion that occasionally we should say, is this a good law or is this a tyrannical law? But we could also say that it is a quite damaging or uncivil factor in our civic debate, both now and then. Because we have this very strong tendency to still call laws and lawgivers tyrants, and maybe they are. Thank you.